Darren, the Shadow Malone. A boy who grew up in Liverpool's toughest streets. A man who rose to rule the city's criminal underworld, and a figure so feared that even his enemies whispered his name in terror. But for all his power, all his cunning, no one saw the danger coming that would end his reign, and leave the city questioning who he really was, and who finally brought him down. Darren, the Shadow Malone, was born into Liverpool's toughest streets, where violence and poverty were the norm, and trust was a luxury few could afford. From an early age, Darren learned that survival required more than strength. It demanded cunning, timing, and an instinct for reading people. His childhood was far from ordinary. His neighborhood was a battleground, and every day felt like a test. By the age of 10, Darren had witnessed fights that left permanent scars on both bodies and minds, and he had already begun developing a reputation for his cleverness. Even as a teenager, Darren had a presence that drew attention. He was small in stature, unassuming at first glance, but there was a quiet intensity in his eyes that unnerved anyone who underestimated him. While other kids were dreaming of football careers or escaping to college, Darren was studying the streets. He watched how rival gangs operated, how police tactics worked, and most importantly, how people could be manipulated with a few well-chosen words or a calculated threat. By 15, he had begun running small-scale operations, shoplifting rings, petty thefts, and eventually, local drug deals. Each success built his confidence, but also his awareness that every move carried a risk. It was during these years that Darren earned his nickname, the Shadow. He moved silently through Liverpool's streets, striking quickly and disappearing without a trace. Neighbors whispered about the boy who seemed to vanish when trouble approached. The one who always seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. This ability to stay unseen while exerting control became his trademark, and soon, even older gang members began noticing him. Where others relied on brute force, Darren relied on strategy, observation, and patience. By the time he reached his early 20s, Darren had transformed from a street-smart kid into a calculated force. He had assembled a small but loyal group of followers, people who recognized his brilliance and feared his wrath. Together, they began taking over parts of Liverpool that had long been contested by rival gangs. Darren's approach was methodical. He didn't rush into confrontations. Instead, he studied his enemies, learned their weaknesses, and exploited them without leaving fingerprints. His rise was quiet, almost invisible, but by the time the law and rival gangs took notice, he had already become a figure of dominance. Darren's influence was not limited to violence. He understood the power of fear, secrecy, and reputation. A single rumor could destabilize an entire rival crew. A strategically leaked threat could force opponents into submission without a fight. He was always calculating, always one step ahead. It wasn't just the street criminals who feared him. Corrupt officials, business owners, and even police officers who stumbled into his path learned quickly that challenging Darren Malone could be fatal. Yet, for all his power, Darren remained a mystery. Friends and acquaintances saw him only in fragments, glimpses of a man who was always alert, always thinking. He cultivated an aura that made people respect him, fear him, and question whether anyone could ever truly know him. Every success added layers to his legend, and every narrow escape from arrest or assassination attempts reinforced it. The streets of Liverpool began to change under his shadow. People whispered his name with caution, rivals plotted in secret, and the city's criminal underworld adjusted to the new ruler who seemed untouchable. By the time Darren Malone was in his mid-20s, he had built an empire. He controlled the flow of drugs, gambling, and protection rackets throughout Liverpool. Even those who tried to oppose him learned that the Shadow did not need to confront his enemies openly. His genius lay in making people act against their own interests, while they believed they were in control. Fear, strategy, and mystery had created a perfect storm, and Darren Malone stood at the center of it, untouchable, unstoppable, and unforgettable. By the early 2000s, Darren the Shadow Malone had transformed from a streetwise survivor into the undisputed ruler of Liverpool's underworld. His empire was no longer a series of small-scale operations. It had become a vast, well-organized network that stretched from the city's docks to its wealthiest neighborhoods. Rival gangs, once aggressive and bold, had learned to tread carefully. Crossing Darren was no longer just dangerous, it was suicidal. Even whispers of defiance vanished under the weight of his reputation. Malone's rule was built on fear, but also on precision. He never wasted energy on unnecessary violence, at least not in public view. Streets that might have seemed chaotic to outsiders were, under Darren, carefully controlled. The chaos existed in shadows, back alleys, abandoned warehouses, and hidden safe houses, where loyalty was tested and betrayal punished without hesitation. People learned quickly that defiance meant disappearing. Even law enforcement struggled to pin anything on him. They had witnesses, leads, and rumors, but Darren had mastered the art of staying invisible. Every plan, every operation was executed with military-like precision. The city's criminal landscape had begun to revolve around him. Drug distribution channels were streamlined. Protection rackets operated like clockwork. Malone understood that fear alone was not enough. Control required organization. He invested in people he could trust, trained them, and gave them responsibility. But he never let anyone know the full scope of his empire. This compartmentalization meant that if someone were captured or killed, the empire remained intact. The Shadow, as he was called, had created a network that thrived even when its operator was unseen. But dominance came with a price. The more powerful Darren became, the more enemies he made. Smaller gangs tried to challenge him, ambitious lieutenants grew jealous, and rival criminals from other cities began to encroach. Malone's response was ruthless. Those who plotted against him vanished, sometimes literally. Whispers circulated of bodies dumped in the Mersey, of rivals left for days in abandoned warehouses, as warnings to others. No one outside his inner circle ever knew the full extent of his wrath. Even as his notoriety grew, Darren remained a shadowy figure. The media picked up fragments of his story, painting him as a ghostly figure who ruled Liverpool's streets with fear and intelligence. Newspapers called him untouchable and the city's phantom menace, but they never captured the full truth. He avoided attention deliberately. He never flaunted wealth, never displayed himself in public. For those who wanted to catch him, the Shadow was always one step ahead, disappearing into the night before anyone could get close. Despite the terror he inspired, there were strange glimpses of a code. Darren did not harm the innocent, nor did he destroy public spaces in his battles. His violence was calculated, targeted, surgical. It was a paradox. He was both feared and strangely respected. The people who lived under his shadow knew the rules: obey, stay silent, survive. And in that way he controlled more than just territory. He controlled perception, making Liverpool itself a stage where his influence seemed omnipresent. Then, just when it seemed his empire was untouchable, cracks began to appear. Rivals whispered of betrayals within his own ranks, of lieutenants who might be feeding information to enemies or even law enforcement. Malone, for all his cunning, could not foresee every threat. The city that he had shaped to his will was starting to show signs of instability. The more he tried to maintain control, the more he realized that fear alone might not be enough to secure loyalty. By the end of this era, Darren Malone was more than a criminal. He was a symbol, a warning. Liverpool had never seen someone like him before. He was strategic, invisible, and terrifyingly intelligent. Every corner of the city seemed touched by his influence. But as powerful as he was, the seeds of danger were already being sown. The same streets he had mastered were beginning to conspire against him in ways he could not yet predict, hinting at a fall that would shock the entire city. Despite ruling Liverpool's streets with unmatched precision, Darren, the Shadow Malone, remained an enigma. Few truly knew him, and fewer still had any insight into his personal life. Friends and family existed at a distance, carefully shielded from the violence and treachery that surrounded him. Those closest to him understood only fragments of the man who had risen from the streets to control the city's criminal underworld. To outsiders, he was a ghost. To insiders, he was a strategist whose mind worked in layers they could never fully understand. Rumors began to circulate of secret alliances, connections that stretched beyond Liverpool itself. Some claimed Darren had ties to powerful figures in other cities, even across the UK, who assisted him in maintaining dominance. Others whispered of corrupt officials, police officers, and politicians who either feared him or profited from him. The lines between loyalty and betrayal blurred, and the deeper the investigation went, the more complex Malone's world appeared. Those who tried to map it often ended up lost in a maze of deception. It became increasingly clear that Malone's control wasn't just built on fear, it was built on information. He collected secrets, observed patterns, and anticipated moves before they happened. He knew who could be trusted, who could be manipulated, and who needed to be removed entirely. Former gang members described his methods as almost surgical. If Malone suspected disloyalty, he would wait. He would watch. Then, at the exact moment when the threat was strongest, he struck in a way that left no evidence, no witnesses, and no chance of retaliation. Even the police found themselves in awe of his brilliance. Investigations often led to dead ends. Informants disappeared. Evidence vanished. Malone had created an empire designed to be untouchable, yet, beneath the surface of his control, a hidden vulnerability, calculating and potentially more dangerous than Malone himself. If true, it meant that the man who had controlled Liverpool's streets so completely might not have been the true mastermind. This secret partner, if real, explained several anomalies that had puzzled police and gang members alike. Rival operations that seemed impossible to anticipate were suddenly neutralized. Internal betrayals were executed with precision. Even Malone's most trusted lieutenants occasionally acted in ways that seemed inconsistent with his direct orders. The Shadow's empire, once thought to be entirely his own, may have been co-piloted by an unseen hand. As Malone's power continued to grow, the tension within his network increased. Trust became fragile, loyalty became conditional, and every interaction carried an unspoken question: who could be trusted, and who was plotting from the shadows? The streets that had once feared him now became a stage of uncertainty, where the line between ally and enemy blurred. Even Darren, the man who had always stayed ahead, had to consider the possibility that his carefully constructed empire contained a hidden threat from within. By the time Malone reached the peak of his influence, his life was a delicate balance between control and paranoia. The city's underworld was under his rule, yet whispers of betrayal and hidden partners haunted every corner. It was a tense equilibrium, one that could collapse with a single misstep. Liverpool's most feared gangster, untouchable and cunning, was now facing a force he could not entirely see. The Shadow, for the first time in his life, was walking among enemies he could not identify, in a game where even the winner might be destroyed. By 2014, Darren the Shadow Malone had ruled Liverpool's streets for more than a decade. Yet even the most untouchable figures eventually faced their reckoning. That year, his empire began to show cracks that no amount of cunning could conceal. Whispers of betrayal within his inner circle became louder. Small mistakes, once easily corrected, now spiraled into dangerous vulnerabilities. Malone, the man who had orchestrated the city's criminal underworld with surgical precision, was suddenly vulnerable to forces he could not fully control. It began quietly. Shipments of drugs disappeared before they reached their destinations. Rival gangs intercepted operations that should have been secure, and confidential information leaked at a rate that alarmed even the most loyal of Malone's lieutenants. Those closest to him tried to explain these failures as coincidences. But Darren knew better. Someone inside his network was turning his own strategies against him. For a man who thrived on control, this realization was a rare and dangerous disruption. Then came the night that would shock Liverpool forever. Darren Malone was found dead in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The discovery was made by one of his own men, someone loyal enough to fear reporting the death too late. The scene was brutal, signs of a violent struggle, the remnants of a struggle that suggested Malone had fought to the very end. But there were no witnesses, No calls for help and no evidence pointing to the killer. The man who had evaded capture, who had outsmarted everyone, had been struck down. The immediate question haunted everyone. Who could have killed Darren Malone? Law enforcement scrambled, combing through decades of connections, enemies and rumors. But the answer was elusive. Some suspected rival gangs, eager to reclaim lost territory. Others pointed to corrupt officials, who may have finally acted against him. But the most chilling theory came from Malone's own network. His death might have been orchestrated by someone he trusted, a secret partner, the shadow behind the shadow, who had quietly undermined his empire for years. Investigators began uncovering evidence that Darren's empire had not been as secure as it appeared. Hidden stashes of cash, secret safe houses, and encrypted files revealed that loyalty in his ranks was conditional. Some lieutenants had been plotting for months, feeding information to rivals or preparing to seize control in the event of his death. It was a bitter irony. The man who had ruled with fear, who had eliminated traitors with ruthless efficiency, had been betrayed by the very system he had built to protect himself. The media dubbed it the fall of Liverpool's most feared gangster. Stories circulated of his cunning, his brutality, and his unmatched control over the city, but also of the mystery surrounding his death. Unlike other criminals who fell after dramatic chases or arrests, Darren's end was silent, almost ghostly, leaving the city with more questions than answers. Was it revenge, a carefully planned assassination, or the inevitable collapse of an empire built on fear rather than trust? Even in death, Malone's influence lingered. His empire did not immediately crumble, it fractured slowly, creating chaos among those who had once obeyed him without question. Rival gangs seized opportunities, law enforcement pushed deeper into criminal networks, and former lieutenants scrambled to claim pieces of power. Liverpool's streets, which had once moved to Malone's rhythm, now convulsed in uncertainty. The fall of Darren Malone was more than the death of a gangster. It was the unraveling of a legend. The shadow had been untouchable, brilliant, and terrifying. But the secrets he kept and the trust he denied ultimately became the forces that destroyed him. The city he ruled would remember him not only for the fear he inspired, but also for the warning his death represented. No matter how invisible, clever, or powerful, even the most feared ruler can be undone by betrayal lurking in the shadows. Even years after his death, Darren, the Shadow Malone, remained more than a memory. He was a legend, a cautionary tale, and a shadow over Liverpool that refused to fade. His empire had fractured, his lieutenants scattered, and rival gangs had tried to seize what he once controlled. Yet every corner of the city still bore the marks of his influence. The streets he had ruled with precision, fear, and intelligence remembered him. Business owners, former criminals, and even police officers would quietly whisper his name, acknowledging the power of a man who had once seemed untouchable. Malone's life was studied, dissected, and mythologized. Documentaries, books, and countless media reports chronicled his rise from a small, clever boy in Liverpool's toughest neighborhoods to the city's most feared gangster. What fascinated people was not just his ruthlessness, but his intelligence. He had ruled with strategy, invisibility, and calculated fear, qualities that kept him ahead of law enforcement and rivals alike. Even in death, he remained an example of what absolute control in the shadows looked like, and the risks that came with it. Yet, the most chilling part of Darren's story was not his rise or his rule, it was the mystery of his fall. Investigations never fully uncovered who killed him or why. Was it a rival gang claiming vengeance, a corrupt official seizing an opportunity, or the elusive secret partner that insiders whispered about? A figure who had quietly undermined him for years. The ambiguity fueled his legend. The shadow had dominated the city, and even in death, he left questions no one could answer. For those who lived through his reign, Malone's legacy was clear. He had shown the terrifying power of fear combined with intelligence. The methods he used to maintain control became case studies for law enforcement and criminal psychologists alike. He had taught the city that dominance didn't require chaos in the streets, it required subtlety, precision, and the ability to make enemies doubt everything around them. Liverpool had never seen another gangster like him, and likely never would. Despite the chaos that followed his death, a strange order remained in his absence. Gangs respected the unspoken rules he had established. Rivals learned to act with caution, knowing that any move could echo the consequences Darren had once enforced. Police investigations continued for years, uncovering hidden assets and connections, yet even the most thorough efforts could not fully map the empire he had built. Malone's network had been designed to survive disruption, and in that way, even in death, his influence lingered. The city's streets had moved on, but the Shadow's presence was still felt. Empty warehouses, abandoned safe houses, and even certain neighborhoods carried a sense of his former control. Rumors of hidden caches, secret allies, and long-forgotten deals persisted. People who had once feared him, or had lived in the orbit of his power, understood that Darren Malone's story was not just a tale of violence and crime, but a story of strategy, invisibility, and the fragile balance between fear and loyalty. Liverpool would remember Darren, the Shadow Malone, as more than a criminal. He was a symbol of what happens when someone can manipulate the city without ever being seen, when one mind can bend loyalty, fear, and secrecy to dominate an entire underworld. His life, his rise, and even his mysterious death left a chilling lesson. Power can be absolute, but it is never guaranteed. The Shadow had ruled Liverpool's streets, and though he was gone, his legend, his fear, and the unanswered questions he left behind continued to haunt the city and would for generations to come. In the end, Darren Malone's story was not just about crime. It was about the limits of trust, the cost of secrecy, and the haunting truth that even the most untouchable figures are not invincible. Liverpool had seen its most feared gangster, and in his absence, the city still felt his shadow.